So I'm sitting here alone in my empty apartment, nothing else to do, so I figured why not do a book review? So the book that I decided to review is by a guy named Stephens-Davidowitz. He studied philosophy and economics, and he was a Google data scientist. And his book is called Everybody Lies, Big Data, New Data, and What the Internet Can Tell Us About Who We Really Are. Hey, thanks, man. It was like... Man, you sure love talking to yourself. Well, I talked to myself because I figured it was the only person that would listen, but that's not even the case. I first heard about this book on the NPR podcast, The Hidden Brain, episode 70, Who We Really Are at 2 a.m. And on that podcast, Seth talks about his book, how he uses big data to answer questions such as, does where do you go to school affect how successful you are? Do parents favor boys over girls? Do violent films affect the crime rate? Can you beat the stock market? How regularly do we lie about our sex lives, and who's more self-conscious about sex, men or women? So what is big data? Big data is an extremely large data set that is analyzed to reveal patterns, trends, associations, especially relating to human behaviors and interaction. On the podcast, Seth gives a good analogy of what big data is by telling a story about his grandmother.
My family was going back and forth. My sister was saying that I need a crazy girl because I'm crazy. My brother was saying that my sister was crazy, that I need a normal girl to balance me out. And my mom was screaming at my brother and sister that I'm not crazy. And my dad was then screaming at my mom that, of course, Seth is crazy. And then my soft-spoken 88-year-old grandma started to speak, and everyone went quiet, and she explained to me that I need a nice girl, not too pretty, very smart, good with people, social so you will do things, sense of humor because you have a good sense of humor. And I described why was her advice so much better than everybody else's. I think one of the reasons is that she's big data, right? So grandmas and grandpas throughout history have had access to more data points than anybody else, and they've been able to correlate larger patterns than anybody else has because they've been around longer.
Now, I'm normally not that interested in the topic of data, but after listening to the podcast and reading some reviews online, I decided, okay, why not try to read this book? So I decided to read it, break it down, and make a review on it. Now, this review is not going to be in-depth at all. It's just going to go over what I felt was the highlights of it for me. And then you can judge if you want to actually purchase the book. So the book is broken down in 3 parts, 8 chapters, and each chapter has about a handful of topics. In part 1, he introduces to the reader how important Google data is. What people leave on the internet is tremendously revealing. They search for facts, quotes, jokes, places, person, things, or help. It turns out you can tell a lot more about what they really think, really desire, really fear, and really do than anyone might have guessed. For example, if someone enters in depression symptoms or have thoughts of their spouse cheating on them, they're willing to enter in information like that into Google. And what Seth did was take that information and drew conclusions upon it. So Seth starts the book off by talking about what he found through the use of big data. He tackles the idea of, is the South more racist in America than any other areas in the United States? What he ends up finding is, it turns out it's not, just pretty much everywhere is racist. Specifically in New York, Western Pennsylvania, Eastern Ohio, in industrial Michigan, and rural Illinois. And the rest of the chapter, he talks about the relationship between the racist data and Trump voters. Like men are to their size, what are the females self-conscious about? Turns out it's their smell. And the relationship between weather and depression. It turns out if a person were to make a move from Chicago to Honolulu, it gets shown to be twice as effective than it to be on medication. The next section is part 2, the powers of big data. This is where the meat of the book is at. It has the most interesting topics. He uses his data alongside some other studies. He begins this section by using his data to go against everyone's favorite neurologist, Freud. Seth talks about his findings, how men are more likely to look up how to orally please themselves than they are to look up how to give a woman an orgasm. Seth has some charts laid across the book, and one of the interesting charts were what we say about our loved ones on social media compared to what we say with them on our searches. He talks about how media outlets tend to either lean more left or more right. Turns out they lean more left. So all these subjects and statements that are spread out through the entire part 2 section revolve around 4 powers. Now, I wish I could tell you about all 4 powers, but I only ended up finding 3. I'm not really the greatest of readers. So the first power is reimagining big data. The value of big data is not its size, is that it can offer you new kinds of information to study. Information that you never previously had collected. The second power of big data is digital truth serum. Certain online sources get people to admit things they would not admit anywhere else. They serve as a digital truth serum. The fourth power of big data, it randomizes experiments, which finds truly casual effects much easier to conduct, anytime, more or less anywhere, as long as you're online. In the era of big data, all the world is a lab. In the final sections of the book, Seth talks about where his study of big data has gotten him. He gets an invite to meet with Lawrence Summers, a well-accomplished man, former vice president of the Development Economics, chief economist of World Banks, senior U.S. Treasury Department during the Clinton administration, former director of the National Economic Council for President Obama. Oh yeah, and the dude was a former president of Harvard University. So Seth talks about how he met with Lawrence and how he was intellectually intimidating and wondering why he wanted to meet with him personally. After going 30 minutes of talking, Lawrence asked, "Are you able to predict the stock market with it?" And Seth replied, "Nah." Following up with his meeting with Lawrence Summers, he talks about dimensionality. Dimensionality is finding patterns in the information that might line up, but that doesn't mean that it's correct. If you look hard enough for a pattern, you're bound to find one. That's why when people find patterns trying to predict the stock market, they end up failing miserably. And Seth wanted to make sure that he was avoiding dimensionality at all costs. So for the conclusion of this book, Seth talks about how many people actually finish books. So Seth, not only did I finish reading your book, I also wrote notes throughout the entire reading. So you at least got one fan in me. Overall, I enjoyed reading this book. Coming from a guy who only reads about a dozen books per year, this was an interesting read. It had a lot of things to say on meaningful subjects, and it was easily digestible. You don't need to be a student of economics, statistics, or social science to understand the book. Your regular average Joe can understand it. My takeaway from this book is be more careful of what you're typing into Google. I'm more knowledgeable and interested in the subjects of big data, and everybody lies. To strangers, families, friends, surveys, and to themselves.